So today we're going to talk about energy flow in an ecosystem. You've already learned about ecosystems in general and biomes in particular, so now we're going to go on to how energy flows through those ecosystems. First thing I want you to do is refresh your memory on how that works. You will have learned that at some point before, probably through talking about who eats whom in an ecosystem. So here's an example of an aquatic ecosystem, and I would like you to take this second to take these animals, orca, also known as killer whale, orca is a better name for it, a cod, krill, algae, and a leopard seal, and decide whom eats whom in that particular food chain. Okay, now that you have done that, we're going to talk about the roles that each organism plays in a food chain or an ecosystem. So first, we have producers. Producers are also known as autotrophs. Auto meaning self, and troph meaning feed. So these are self-feeders. Now, of course, as a teenager, hopefully you are feeding yourself also. But this means more literally self-feeding. They produce their own food. So they make their own food, usually through photosynthesis, which uses light, and that's generally what we will focus on in this class, this biology class. However, there are some that are also chemosynthetic, or not also, but instead of photosynthetic, they are chemosynthetic, in which case they use the energy in bonds instead of sunlight to produce sugars. Those organisms are usually the beginning of an energy flow or food chain in areas where light does not reach, such as the bottoms of the ocean. So plants are usually who you think of when you think of producers, but anything that can photosynthesize and convert the energy from something else or use the energy from something else to convert inorganic molecules into organic ones would be a producer. This includes plants such as the Venus flytrap, which are carnivorous plants. So they may appear to consume insects, and they do, but they don't do it in order to create sugars. What they're getting from the insects is different kind of nutrients, usually nitrogen, because they live in areas that are swampy areas often that are very poor in particular nutrients needed. The soil there is poor in those nutrients, such as nitrogen. So they will digest insects in order to obtain the nitrogen and other essential nutrients out of those insects. However, they are still producers because they're actually making sugars. Okay, so what is the actual origin of the energy? We know producers are the first things in a food chain, but where are they getting their energy? This is where photosynthesis comes in, or chemosynthesis, but we're going to focus on photosynthesis. So the chemical equation for photosynthesis is 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water yields, in chemistry, you read this arrow as a yields, glucose, which is sugar, essentially it's the sugar like you eat, plus 6 molecules of oxygen. So this is the key right here. They're building glucose and other carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, that they will use to store their energy, and they can use that for growth. But what are they doing? They're taking inorganic CO2, these 6 molecules, 6 molecules of inorganic water, and in the presence of sunlight. So sometimes you'll see this equation written as plus sunlight. They don't add sunlight into a chemical equation like that. What they're doing, and we'll learn more about this when we do photosynthesis in detail, they're taking the energy in the actual light, the wavelengths of light, and they're using that energy to convert those inorganic molecules into this organic molecule. And that's actually a very complicated process that's difficult, so that's why you or I can't do it. We are definitely not specialized to do that. There are very specialized parts inside the cells of these producers that do that. And yes, you need to know this equation. So 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water yields 1 glucose plus 6 oxygen. CO2 plus H2O yields C6H12O6 plus O2. This is the start of all energy in ecosystems. The producers doing this particular process. Okay, from there, we get to the consumer level, or the heterotroph. Heterotroph. So in this case, hetero means other, and troph again is feed. So these feed on others. And there's several subcategories within consumers. So they can't make their own food. They get energy from eating the other organisms. So other organisms have gotten the energy either by making it themselves, such as a producer, or by eating another kind of animal. And they're now storing, just like you, energy in the form of sugars and other complex biological molecules. So there's the herbivores, which eat primarily plants. There's carnivores, which eat primarily other animals. So here's an herbivore. This caterpillar is going to eat primarily plants. This polar bear is actually one of the only fully carnivorous bears. Most bears are actually omnivores. And then the omnivores, which means everything, they eat basically a variety of things. You technically are an omnivore. Even if you're a vegetarian, by choice, humans are evolved to be omnivores, eating plants and animals and seeds and nuts and fruits and all different kinds of meats. And then there's also scavengers who specifically specialize in eating detritus or dead animals. Okay, and finally we have decomposers. These are other organisms in the ecosystem, other biotic factors that break down the waste in the dead organisms and return that raw material back to the environment. So bacteria do this, fungi often do this, worms do this. There's a variety of decomposers. Okay, so now I want you to practice for a minute. This animal, producer or consumer, in case you don't know, it's an elk, and it's going to be a consumer. What kind of consumer? Specifically, it's an herbivore. Producer or consumer, this is an apple tree. Producer or consumer? This is a producer. Producer or consumer? This is a subspecies of the brown bear. This one in particular, I believe, is a Kodiak, which is a kind of grizzly bear. This is also a consumer. But what kind of consumer? I mentioned it before. Most bears are actually omnivores. They specialize in catching fish, as I'm sure you've seen in videos during the right time of year, but they will also eat grasses and berries and fruits and nuts and other small mammals that they can catch, even sometimes large mammals that they can catch them and bring them down. Okay, producer or consumer. This is actually a lynx. So hopefully you recognize that as a consumer, and specifically, this is a carnivore. Okay, producer or consumer. In case you don't recognize it, this is an animal we often see in town, and even near the high school where we're at, especially above the cemetery area. Not because it's a cemetery, but there are good thermal vents, airflows that they often like to ride around there. You'll see them in with the right conditions. They'll circle very carefully, and they rock a little bit when they are flying because they're taking in lots of smell from all over the area. They have these big areas in their beaks that let in lots of airflow to smell very well. The reason for that, they are turkey vultures, so they are a consumer. Obviously, they're not making their own food, and specifically, they are scavengers, cleaning up the dead stuff. Okay, so that's a quick and easy overview of producers and consumers. So from this, you should remember that energy, where do you get your energy? What you eat, right? Flows through ecosystems. It starts at the very beginning with photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields glucose, which is C6H12O6 plus 6 O2. We will talk about that again more when we talk about photosynthesis, but this right here is where energy is ultimately stored in living organisms, and through another process that we will learn, organisms harvest the energy out of these molecules to do the work of everyday life. We'll talk about that more too when we talk about the more specifics of how energy flows in the next video. And then you should understand producers and consumers. And specifically, you have various kinds of consumers in an ecosystem that fill different niches that will consume different organisms depending upon if they're an herbivore or a carnivore, an omnivore, or a scavenger. Okay.